came back home. I was obviously drunk. My mom threw me in the car while I was still hungover the next day and drove me out to my grandparents' house in Chalmette that had flooded up to the gutters, and then went and ran some errands while I just sat there super hungover in my grandparents' like gutted out house talking to my grandpa about how bad their situation was. So that kind of scared me straight. That was not fair to my mom. Sorry, Mom. My name is Jared Marcel. The neighborhood I resided in when Katrina hit, I had just moved into the dorms at Loyola maybe 2 days before, but my mom's house was in Metairie. So a brief background of my family's history in New Orleans. On my mom's side, we're about as Cajun as you can get. My mom's dad was adopted, so we don't really know a whole lot about that, but my mom's maiden name is Baudouin. My dad's family is from somewhere else. My dad's dad is from Wisconsin, met my grandmother at a USO dance down here, but my dad's mom's maiden name is Vinette. There were 7 brothers and 2 sisters. All the brothers went to Jesuit, so I'm a 3rd generation Jesuit student, 3rd generation Jesuit alum, right? I'm not still a student. The first thing that I remember about evacuating is being incredibly hungover. I don't drink anymore, but as I'm sure you can imagine, as a sophomore at Loyola, we had just moved into the dorms maybe a night or 2 before we were told we had to evacuate. So I was living in a suite with, I think, 6 or 7 other guys, and I was the only person who was born and raised here in that group. Some of the other guys, their parents were still here, and so all of the parents descended on this tiny little dorm, and they were all looking at me like, what do we do here? And I was like, I don't know, I'm 19, right? So we all drove to my mom's house, and then they started asking the same questions of her out in Metairie, and decisions had to be made quickly because there were plane flights out that were already booked for parents to go back to Miami, Chattanooga, and so some of them were able to just purchase tickets for their kids to just go on the same plane back home, but then some of them wound up like hopping in cars with other people, and then we managed to get to my mom's older brother's house in Watson. It's like right outside of Baton Rouge. I had just bought a truck over the summer, so I didn't want to lose that. So my mom and I drove separately. My phone was blowing up the entire time as we were driving because I had all these other people from Loyola that I had been living with that were all sitting there trying to figure their plans out. And then, once we all did finally disperse, then it was just this sort of chaotic, just phone ringing off the hook. Once we got to Baton Rouge, my uncle who was living in Chalmette, my mom's younger brother, we couldn't get in touch with him for maybe a week and a half, and his house flooded up to the gutter, and we had no way to get in touch with him at all because he didn't have a cell phone at the time. Basically, he was evacuating and got stuck in traffic and didn't really understand the threat, so he was like, this is stupid, I'm just stuck in traffic, and then turned around and went home. And then had to cut his boat free in the middle of the storm. Once everything flooded, he could get from Chalmette to the lake and then cross to the lake and then called us from a payphone after he had crossed the lake on a flatboat. Yeah, communication was a challenge. My first thought was that I didn't know whether New Orleans was ever gonna be like a thing again. I was starting to call around to see if I could get into other schools. Everybody else that I knew at Loyola had transferred to like Loyola Marymount, Loyola Chicago, Spring Hill, wherever, and then I dropped out for the semester and gutted houses in Metairie. So I would take an extra class every single semester, if not two. And then I still wound up graduating on time with all of the people that I started with at Loyola, even though I dropped out for the Katrina semester. When I saw the news coverage, it seemed like this is unsalvageable. And then being in it after all of that time, I realized like, oh, this is just stuff and it can be repaired. I think this was one of the most televised things that I had ever seen in real time. 24-hour news is a really prevalent thing now, but I think this was one of the first things in my lifetime that I can remember. The 24-hour news cycle just like couldn't get enough of this tragedy. With the 24-hour news cycle, you have to just fill the time. So they had a bunch of B-roll running of different neighborhoods that were flooded, and they weren't making it clear that these B-roll videos were hours old, days old. They weren't announcing what neighborhood they were pulling this B-roll footage from, and it was the first time that my grandmother had seen a ticker move across the bottom of the screen while there was also a headline at the bottom of the screen, while somebody is sitting there talking on one side of the screen and there's B-roll moving on the other side of the screen, and my poor grandmother thought that all of this information was related. We're having to tell her these things aren't necessarily related. Still, it was like the first time of being, in my lifetime, of being just like glued to the screen and then having this person next to me who just didn't necessarily understand how sensational and sensationalized the news was that we were watching. If I would say that I discovered something about myself during that time, I would say it's just how not necessarily tied to material things I am. It was sort of surprising to me how much easier it was for me than for my mom and some of my other relatives to just sort of walk in and be like, there are obviously some sentimental things here, but they're just things. Granted, I was only 19 or 20, so it's not like I personally had worked my whole life to, buy this house and buy these things in this house. I had a good enough perspective to know that there were other people elsewhere in the city who lost family members, like people died. The things like rugs and couches and stuff in the pantry and all of the laundry that I left on the floor, none of that mattered. For me, it was kind of like, okay, well, somebody's got to clean it up. It's what I'm doing during the day anyway, so it's just got to get torn out, and the longer I sit here and ruminate over it, the longer the task is going to take. One of the funniest things that would happen, so when I got back into town, I was living with my boss. He was a trim carpenter and a cabinet maker, but obviously for a little while, nobody's ready for that, so you gotta just do whatever. So we were gutting houses in his neighborhood and my neighborhood, and I would work a full day with him, and then I would go gut my mom's house, and then I would go from work to gutting my mom's house to then home long enough to shower and then go to a bar or whatever and come back. But our dog wound up living back at our house while it was being gutted. And when we tore up the floor, we found there was a part of the subfloor that just didn't have any subfloor there. So there was a huge hole in the ground. And when we would open the front door, our dog would come pop up through the hole and come and greet us. For the rest of the time that we lived in the house with her, she would like run around and get under the house and then stick her little face through the holes in the brick to like watch us as we were leaving. Yeah, it was sort of like our dog's discovery that the underside of the house was like, her little like Narnia or whatever. If I could go back and change one or two things, I'm sure you can imagine I was 19 or 20 and I'm living in a hotel room with my mom while I don't have any of my college friends. All of my high school friends, if I wanted to see them, I had to drive to Baton Rouge. There were a few bars uptown that at the time had a reputation for serving people underage, and a lot of the National Guard people who were enforcing the Orleans Parish curfew were also underage. So we sort of developed this like quid pro quo of like, if you buy the National Guard guys a couple of drinks, they would escort you to the parish border to make sure that you got across the border like at curfew time. If I went back in time, I would cut that part out because there were a couple of times that I wound up back in the hotel room with my mom just like totally smashed. That was not fair to my mom. Sorry, Mom. There was one time in particular that I did that. I came back home. I was obviously drunk. I was causing a big stir. I won't get into the details, but kept my mom up all night. And rather than sit there and give me a big lecture about it, my mom threw me in the car while I was still hungover the next day and drove me out to my grandparents' house in Chalmette that had flooded up to the gutters, and then went and ran some errands while I just sat there super hungover in my grandparents' like gutted out house talking to my grandpa about like how bad their situation was and like trying not to let on to the fact that I could like barely maintain my balance. So that kind of scared me straight. Even in these regrettable moments, there were still formative moments that I still keep with me and sort of propelled me forward. Even though I would probably want to go back and change those things, I still learned from those things and am a better person for having learned that maybe you shouldn't do those things to your parents. This is a drum key. I was in the music business program at Loyola and I'd completed my freshman year. I was still playing the first drum set that I ever had, and I stole that drum set from my cousin. So then when I started gutting houses when I got back to town, I was getting paid like $200 a day, and other than beer, had nothing to spend it on. So I stuffed aside like 2 or 3 days worth of pay, and once I got access back to my rehearsal space, I went to Ray Franson's drum center and I spent a few days' wages on a new drum set so that I had some incentive to go to this rehearsal space and practice while nobody else was in town. I mean, none of my college friends, none of my high school friends, none of the musicians that I knew from the music scene were in town, but I invested in this set so that I would have a reason to go to that rehearsal space. My son tore the chain off, but the chain that the drum key hung from came from a fan that I tore down out of the first house that I gutted. So I was hanging the drum key from basically the means by which I bought the key. It was like a thing that I bought to sort of like open up the next chapter for myself. In Stoicism, one question that I've sort of latched onto is what's at stake here. So when you ask what's at stake here for certain people, someone who lost a person in the storm, lost a loved one, the stakes are much higher for them. Somebody who didn't have insurance, the stakes are much higher for them too, right? And we kind of touched on that, like how would I react now? Well, the stakes are higher for me now because I have a family and I actually own the home, and I put all these years into accumulating the stuff that's in the home. I think I was sort of able to recognize that because the stakes are so much higher for other people, that I can kind of take a step back and be thankful for the things that maybe didn't happen to me. And I could be thankful for the ways that I'm kind of lucky here. Being able to recognize that the stuff is just stuff made it a lot easier for me when you sort of ask like what's at stake here, it kind of helps you create that space for other people. Like, oh yeah, like the stakes were low for me, but like, man, I'm really sorry to hear about what happened in your situation. If you were talking to somebody else, like it sounds like the stakes were a lot higher for you. I'm sorry to hear that. If it's all just stuff and you've just been looking for an excuse to throw whatever away. If you got some like weird tchotchke gift from somebody as a gag and you just never had the heart to throw it away, like here's your chance.